Um, I guess I'll start with introducing myself. I'm Claire Lewis, and I'm the Florida Friendly Community Statewide Coordinator for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. I live in Gainesville. The plant I'm having the most problem with is Mexican petunia at my mother-in-law's house because she loves it and she won't cut it down. So that's my issue. And today's webinar, what we're going to, it's going to provide an overview of the IFAS Assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas and the Florida Invasive Species Council plant list. It's brought to you by Dr. Deah Lieurance with the University of Florida Agronomy Department and the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. As you may know, we're partnering with the Water Management District and Florida Water Star to develop a certification for new homes. And in the past, Florida Water Star has only used the FFL list. But by virtue of this partnership, they're transitioning to using the IFAS assessment. So this webinar is going to provide some guidance for this transition and to discuss the differences between the lists. And most of you probably know the drill by now. Your microphones have been muted, so please type your questions into the chat box and we'll take questions at the end of the webinar. And please remember to fill out the exit survey before you leave today. This gives us valuable information on how we're meeting your educational needs and what topics are of interest to you. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Deah Lieurance is an extension specialist in the Agronomy Department at the University of Florida. She's been the coordinator of the IFAS Assessment since 2013. She received her Ph.D. from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio in 2012. And prior to that, she spent 3 years in Fort Lauderdale working on the development of biocontrol agents at the USDA Invasive Research Laboratory. She currently serves on the board for the North American Invasive Species Management Association and is the incoming chair for the Florida Exotic Pest Council, FFL. Dr. Lieurance's specialty is in invasion science and prevention of future biological invasions. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lieurance. Thank you.
Thanks a bunch. I appreciate that. I'll just clarify 2 things that have changed since that bio was written. FFL is now Florida Invasive Species Council. So we're going through a name change, and I'm actually the chair now. It's been a full year of chairing the committee or chairing the organization while doing it from home. But we're still trying to launch that new name and get the branding going for that. But today, I get an hour, so I'm going to take the liberty to give you a little short course on invasive species and sort of how a non-native species can become invasive and sort of use that to segue into what the IFAS assessment does. I'm going to talk about some of the plant lists that are available in the state, including the Florida, what was formerly known as the FFL list, now the FISC list. And then tell you a little bit about a project that we're wrapping up to try to identify potential invaders that might not necessarily be on our radar. So to get started here, we're just going to go through some standardized terminology, the invasion process, negative impacts of invasive species. I'm going to talk to you about the invasion curve, and then the other stuff that I had mentioned previously. So first, to get started on terminology, the extension community at University of Florida is trying to get everyone on the same page when we talk about the terminology that we use around invasive species. There's a lot of confusion. Some things get thrown around like invasive exotics, native invasives. There's no such thing as a native invasive. That's a weed, and things like that. So to work on this, a group of researchers and extension agents got together and they wrote a paper that's publicly available in Journal of Extension, where we just established these benchmark definitions. So first, a native species is a species that occurs naturally in a specified geographic area. A non-native species is a species that does not occur naturally in a specified geographic area. And finally, the invasive species definition is a species that is non-native to the region, is spreading, and whose presence causes or is likely to cause environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. And it's important to note that invasive species can be plants, animals, or other organisms such as bacteria, fungi. So the invasion process is a stepwise process, and there are barriers at each of these steps. And the important thing to note here is that not all introductions result in an invasion. So the 5 steps are transport. First, the species has to be moved from one geographic location to the other. Then it must be introduced. So in the case of plants, an introduction can be as simple as, digging a hole in your yard and plopping a plant in there. But then it has to become established. And establishment, the things have to match up and they have to be able to thrive and grow in your geographic area. And then next we have spread. So it has to reproduce, and then those seeds or propagules need to be moved across the landscape. And then finally, as those invasions take hold, the final step is that there has to be impacts, negative impacts, and that could be fires or crowding out, your native species. We're going to go through each of these steps with a little more detail now. So transport, here we see, this is a map of global shipping routes. It's a reverse heat map. So the lighter the color, the more frequent the trips back and forth. But this just illustrates how interconnected the continents are. And if you think about what kind of ships go around in these global shipping routes, think about the ports of Miami and Fort Lauderdale with those big ships with those giant cargo containers. So there's goods in each of those containers. And in those containers, there's, the potential for, either an accidental or an intentional introduction. And then also think about, so this is just shipping. Think about all the flights that go back and forth and the tourism and trade that we have as we globalize our world. Next, we have to have an introduction. So I'm going to talk about 2 different kinds of introductions. First is the intentional introduction. So this could be for horticulture or agricultural purposes, erosion control, wildlife improvement. And the classic example for this erosion control is kudzu, the vine that ate the South. And you can see here a couple clippings from back in the day. Grow a vine like this over your porch. A valuable new Florida forage plant. So kudzu was introduced, it first came over for one of the World's Fairs, and people were so impressed with how quickly it had grown and over these trellises for the World's Fair, that they got this idea, this is all during the Dust Bowl and that ecological disaster that led to the Great Depression. And they thought, we're going to create jobs. So they hired a bunch of people for the Civilian Conservation Corps and Tennessee Valley Authority, and literally went out and planted this, amazing plant to try to fix the soil. And they didn't know, it was the best intentions with a, not the best outcome, that this species wasn't actually going to help. It was going to, you see this huge kudzu invasion into a forest. So that would be a good example of an intentional introduction. As in terms of accidental, you might have ballast water. So the ships I mentioned, the shipping routes, if you have a ship that's loaded down with cargo, it goes to its port, unloads that cargo. Well, there's a whole bunch of weight that needs to be counterbalanced that you've taken off the ship. So often those ships will pull up water to sort of offset that weight. Then when they go back to their port, dump that water. Well, if that water isn't treated, there's a potential for an introduction there. And that's how it's thought that zebra mussels got into the Great Lakes. But you can also have unprocessed wood shipping materials like these pallets here. That's how it's thought that emerald ash borer was introduced. The larva was in unprocessed wood, and the adults emerge up in Michigan. And within just a few decades, this one insect is wiping out an entire genus of trees, the ash trees. So that's a very good example. But you can have something as simple as hitchhikers. So think about a burr like getting stuck in your dog's fur or on your pants, as my friend Danielle, after looks like a pretty grueling day in the field. So those are your accidental. So there's your introduction part. Next, for establishment, there's a lot of things that have to match up. So the soil types and, precipitation, and temperature, hardiness zones. And here for the example of climate matching for establishment, I just drew some lines over the world map. And you can see just where the United States kind of lines up with the rest of the world. And some of these places are, some of the most biodiverse parts overlap with Florida in particular, because of our tropical, subtropical climate. And here you can see a mimosa tree. This is data from GBIF. All of the, again, this is another heat map. So in this case, the darker the color, the more records. And you can just see, let me find my cursor. Here is the invasion in the United States, and it just almost lines up perfectly with its native range. So that would be, you know, climates matching. That's pretty intuitive. And then next we have to spread. And so some of the biological traits of common invasive species are things like short time to reproduction, high seed production, like this Brazilian pepper tree, and Melaleuca down here, all these tiny, tiny seeds. And you can also have vegetative spread, as illustrated here with these bamboo culms coming up. If you've ever seen, there's, you know, property disputes about, you know, somebody plants a running bamboo in their yard and the runners go into their neighbor's yard, and that can, you know, cause damage to people's, you know, foundations and such. But also all of those runners, if they break off, float down a stream, that could be an introduction event. And then finally, our impacts. So you might have something like changes in water and nutrient cycling. So say a plant gets established, it uses water more efficiently than the natives, where you're going to change the hydrology of the environment. Or it's a nitrogen fixer, it's going to put more nitrogen in the soil. Altered disturbance regimes, like this Melaleuca fire on top, that's a, you know, fire adapted ecosystem. When there's a Melaleuca invasion, you know, what was normally a slow and low burn is now, you know, you've got, you know, goes up into the trees, and you've got these really intense hot fires that really changes the way that that ecosystem functions. And then increases in resource competition. On the bottom photo here, this is Bob Pemberton for scale, showing you know, a Ligonium invasion overtopping the trees. As you can imagine, underneath there, you're not going to, the resource and competition here is light. So ultimately, all of these ecosystem impacts will result in a reduction of native species. And here's just a picture of before and after of, you know, it's also happening in the water. So this is a Hydrilla invasion before and after treatment. So you can just see, you know, as you can imagine, a lot of our native aquatic species are bottom rooters, and a lot of our non-native aquatic and invasives are float, you know, they're float on the top of the water. And so, you know, they just sort of take the nutrients and the sunlight away from our native aquatic species. There are also economic costs of biological invasion. So you can have significant impacts to our recreation, agriculture, and ecosystem services. A really good example of the way it can impact agriculture is what's happening with our citrus crops. Citrus canker was non-native, but also citrus greening is non-native. And greening is vectored by a non-native insect. When it pierces our citrus trees, it can infect the trees with this bacteria. So far, over 80% of our citrus has been infected, and it's estimated around $1.7 billion in losses over just 5 years to this one invasion vectored by this insect. And then finally, they're very expensive to manage. So estimates exceed about $100 million per year. We did a little research project to look at, you know, how much are we spending in Florida just on managing invasive plants on our natural areas. So in our state parks, national parks, we're spending about $43 million per year on invasive plant management. And most of that's being taken up by, you know, just a few species. So the blue is aquatic, the green is terrestrial. And so here we have Hydrilla, and here's a Hydrilla invasion at Wakulla Springs. And then you've got your water hyacinth, Melaleuca, Brazilian pepper tree, and Ligonium are top 5 here. So there's also impacts to human health. You know, this is pretty dramatic, but, you know, there's people keep these giant land snails for pets. And at times, you know, snails have been tied to rat lungworm, which can be fatal to humans. But, you know, it's not all animals. You know, some things can be incredibly dramatic, and, you know, you can have these human health impacts from plants. And this is giant hogweed. It's important to note that this isn't quite here in Florida just yet. but this was brought over for Victorian landscaping. Pretty big, these got these big flower heads, beautiful plant, but you see these folks here in hazmat suits, basically. That is because to cut it down, kill it, get rid of it, you have to be very careful, because if you get any of the sap on your skin, it's a photoreactive irritant that can cause, what's the equivalent to third-degree burns. I'm showing day 8 and 9 and month 5 after someone got into hogweed. The first few days are disgusting to look at. It's very painful. One kid was doing some cleanup. He got into some hogweed, didn't know it. The sap got in his eyes and he lost one of his eyes. So it's very serious. Not so serious, human health impacts can be as simple as, increases in allergens with pollen in the air from, I'm very allergic personally to Elaeagnus, your olives, your Russian olive, your autumn olive and such. So human health impacts. So now we're going to shift over to the invasion curve. So we talked about the processes for invasion. Let's talk about, this is sort of how an invasion plays out. So first you have your entry of your non-native species. And as you move through time, your management costs increase, and so does the area invaded. This curve is divided into 4 zones. We start with prevention down here and finish with control and management. As you get up to the control and management, our odds of eradicating that species diminish. Like it's virtually impossible to get rid of those species completely. So for that reason, we want to try to stay down here in the prevention eradication part of the curve. And that's where the IFAS, at the University of Florida, where the IFAS assessment comes in. So why is Florida so, why do we have so many invasive species? I mentioned before, our climate overlaps with a lot of the most biodiverse regions of the world. So we have that tropical, subtropical climate, and we're a tourism and trade hotspot. So here's those shipping containers I was mentioning. This is the Port of Miami. I believe this is also the Port of Miami, and you can see these cruise ships lined up. We also have all of, Disney and Universal and all of the, I think the number is 30. We have 30 ports of entry in the state. 85% of all non-native plants enter through one of the ports of Florida. And currently we have over 1,400 non-native species in our herbarium records. Not all of those are invasive, but it's just it's a really big number when you consider only about 2,800 native species in our herbarium records. So a huge number of non-natives here in the state. So this is where the assessment comes in. We have 3 tools that we use to evaluate non-native species to try to determine if those species are either going to be invasive or are invasive in Florida. I will say that the conclusions of the IFAS assessment are, everybody who represents the University of Florida are supposed to adhere to these conclusions. So if something's deemed invasive, those species cannot be recommended by university faculty, staff, or anybody affiliated with the university. So the first tool is a predictive tool, which evaluates the risk. We're trying to predict what might become invasive, and we hope to do that ideally before a species enters the state. Status assessment is more of a diagnostic tool, so we want to evaluate species that are present in the state. And then the infra-specific taxon protocol evaluates the invasion risk of cultivars. And those cultivars are usually species that we know at least one of the parent species is invasive in Florida. And just a little more detail here. The predictive tool is based on, we modified risk assessment called weed risk assessment from Australia to alter the questions about climate, precipitation, and soil type to fit, to make accurate predictions for our state. Again, we want to evaluate species that are new to the state, propose for a new use, or in some cases upon specific request. We've looked at over 200 species, and for example, here's one of our newer ones in the database. This is beach vitex, which is very invasive in the Carolinas, just starting to pop up in Florida. So we did evaluate that species with the predictive tool. So it's 49 questions about the history and biogeography, life history, ecology of the species. We might ask questions about the invasion history. How do the species disperse? What kind of plant are they? Are they, nitrogen fixing woody plants, aquatics, grasses? And all those questions, as you answer them, they're scored. So usually a -1 to a 1. Some questions are weighted higher than others. So if it's invasive elsewhere as an environmental weed, those get us, that scores a 4. But you take these cumulative scores and add them up. So pluses and minuses, and anything under a 1 is a low risk for invasion. A 1 to 6 is to evaluate further or moderate risk. And over 6 is a high risk for invasion. So those moderates that evaluate further, you know, there's just not enough information to make to place that species definitively in a high or low risk. So that's hence the moderate. Shifting to the status assessment, I just point out here, all of our conclusions are divided by zones, north, central, and south. So you can see that here. Those zones were determined roughly based on hardiness zones. So again, we want to evaluate species that are already here. And we describe the status of the species based on, you know, the stuff I talked about before: ecological impacts, potential for expanded distribution, and management difficulty. In some cases, if there's economic value that the plant will bring to the Florida's economy, we do consider that as well. We have about 550 some species evaluated with this tool. These are regularly reevaluated, so I can't really keep up with all of that for all those species. So we use data from the field, from our experts in the field, to complete these assessments. Some examples of ecological impacts: we want to know what natural areas the species is present. Those long-term alterations to ecosystem processes, and any interactions with threatened and endangered species. And here we have a Miami blue. This is a pawpaw tree and a scrub jay, some of our threatened and endangered species in Florida. Management impacts: we want to know control methods. Is it hard to control? Are the populations hard to access? And is it expensive? And here's just some examples of some management options. So prescribed burns, herbicide application, and in this final picture here, this is a mechanical control where they're grinding down Melaleuca trees. All right, the final tool is the infraspecific taxon protocol. Again, this is for our cultivars, varieties, subspecies. And we want to make sure that the recommendations for the parent species are not the same for these cultivars before they're released to the public. This is more of an internal tool. I've used it a couple times for the state, but mostly I use it within the university system, and it's written into the cultivar release process. Here's this Ruellia simplex, that Mexican petunia Claire was talking about at the beginning. And this is an improved cultivar. They're sterile, they don't produce seeds. The pollen is, largely sterile, mostly sterile. But these do sucker. So for that reason, these are all the Ruellia cultivars are cautions. You could still recommend the use, but you want to tell people, give them a heads up that they're gonna sucker, and they're gonna have to manage those to prevent escape. And Ruellia in general is just kind of a headache because it, spreads that way. You might recommend putting them in some containers or something like that. And then here's Lantana, wild type Lantana, and one of the improved cultivars, the Bloomify Red. So this is sterile, it doesn't spread. These are green. Green means go. These are okay to recommend. Okay, so how do you look up plants at the IFAS assessment? We have 900 species. You can go to the assessment.ifas.ufl.edu. And once you get to this page, if you click this assessments up here, or view all assessments here, it'll take you to all 900 species. From there, you can filter by conclusion, zone, growth form, etc. As you're pulling these lists, you can download those into an Excel spreadsheet and, take out whatever information you don't need, sort them whatever way you might, that suits your purpose the best. Okay, possible conclusions. Everything's color coded: red, yellow, or green, like a stoplight. So red means no, do not recommend these species. There's a little bit of verbiage, the language is different depending on the tool that's used, but for status assessment and ITP conclusions, you're gonna see invasive no uses, and that just means invasive not recommended. You cannot recommend these if you are representing the University of Florida. And if you're planting these, you should not plant these in your yard. Caution, so your yellows, like again, this is caution, manage to prevent escape. For the status assessments, we do reevaluate these we try every 2 years, depending on the data that's coming in from the field. But we want to keep an eye on this because it's caution. Again, we don't really know if it's invasive or non-invasive. It's showing some tendencies. It's starting to encroach in natural areas. So we want to really capture when that happens, and discourage the use to try to prevent that from happening. And then finally, green, not a problem species. You'll see documented or undocumented. That just means whether or not there's a record in a natural area. And these are not considered a problem at this time. You may be recommended. For predictive tool conclusions, you're going to see this invasion risk. So high, moderate, low invasion risk. So these are just, just note that the wording here is predicted. Like we aren't saying these are invasive now. We're saying that all the data leads to the prediction that if we start planting this in Florida, it's going to escape, it's going to become invasive. So we don't recommend those for that reason. We're trying to keep the invasion from happening. Moderate risk evaluate, I explained earlier, and then finally low invasion risk. You can recommend these species. I'm going to shift to other relevant plant lists in Florida. Claire asked me to talk about the Flipsy now FISC list. But I'm also going to just briefly tell you about some changes with the Florida Noxious Weed List. So Florida Noxious Weed List basically regulates, this is the only regulatory list that we do have an aquatic list as well. But one of the big changes with our Noxious Weed List in September, they did add all of those aquatic species to this Florida Noxious Weed List. So it's like more of a one-stop shop. All of the prohibited species in the state of Florida are in the IFAS Assessment website. So you'll see those conclusions as prohibited. So we just did that so it's easier to pull it all up at once, but that is the regulatory. If you see prohibited, there are legal ramifications for planting and moving around those species. So you can just see here, the important things is it's a serious agricultural threat, or it's going to have a negative impact on your endangered, threatened, or commercially exploited plant species, looking for things that disrupt our natural ecosystems as well. For these species, nursery sales are prohibited and their movement is regulated by Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services, Division of Plant Industry. So there are penalties to this. Seizure and destruction without compensation. Violators may be found guilty of a second-degree misdemeanor, and there are fines. They're not going to come after you if you make a mistake, but more importantly, just don't call and ask your extension agent before you dispose of these things. If you are trying to cut some of the stuff out of your yard, double bag it. Do not compost it. So here is just some of the prominent species on our noxious weed list. This is Kogan grass. Really nice, actually beautiful picture. And then here is water hyacinth, invading one of our aquatic systems. And this is Brazilian pepper tree. I will briefly tell you, over Christmas, a friend of mine sent me this link. Someone was making the most beautiful wreaths, Christmas wreaths, very artfully done, beautiful wreaths out of Brazilian pepper tree. So I had to email this lady, and I was like, look, FDAX, you can't sell these things, because she was using the berries. So they didn't fine her. They just contacted her very politely and told her not to do it anymore. Okay, Florida Invasive Species Council, formerly known as FFL. So we have two categories of plants that go on these lists. Category ones are invasive exotics. Note that I'm working with now that I'm the chair, removing some of this language, the exotics. We're trying to get away from that, but this is their working definition. So these are non-native invasive species that are altering native plant communities by displacing native species, changing community structures or ecological functions, or hybridizing with natives. I think you're noticing the pattern through here, these, influencing threatened and endangered species, the emphasis on, how these species are really impacting our native communities. That's consistent across all of these lists and programs, but so there's just a note here about, it doesn't rely on the economic severity or geographic range of the problem. So if you have a small population that's doing a lot of impacts, those species can be added to a category one. Category 2, these are increasing in abundance or frequency, but have not yet altered Florida's plant communities. So we are working on the potential to release a third list, which is it'll be a watch list. So these are species that are, it would be the equivalent of our cautions in the IFAS assessment. So how is this list different than what I do at the IFAS assessment? The IFAS assessment is based in literature-based, technical screening tools, invasive plant screening tools. There's a whole, risk assessment, risk analysis. There's a whole community of people who do what I do. It's tested, most the tools are accurate. The predictive tool is accurate up to, I believe, 94-95% accurate across multiple geographies and geographic scales. So ours is more scientifically based. The FLEPSI group, FISC group, basically is more of a consensus building exercise. So there's a plant list committee. We meet quarterly. People can submit requests to add species to our plant list. We sit in a group, we read over the information, experts can come in and, we can ask some questions. Then we vote. It's just a simple consensus building. But one thing that they did do a few years ago when they added me to the plant list committee is ask me to, in most cases for new species, they, I wear two hats so it gets confusing, but consult the IFAS assessment. So they'll use the IFAS assessment results in conjunction with the consensus building. So we're trying to integrate the two so there's less discrepancy, but at this point, there's only a few species that we differ in our conclusions. Mostly that is due to, if we are using our conclusions from the predictive tool, if we're predicting risk, they're more literal, like what is happening. So I can answer questions if that wasn't clear at the end of the talk here. So there's a lot here with those lists. Florida has a lot of lists. So my colleague Lynn Geddes and I got together and decided to write an EDIS paper on how to navigate these lists. So we go over the federal noxious weed list, the Florida aquatic and terrestrial list, FLEPSI, now FISC, and then the IFAS assessment, and sort of talk about, which ones do you use when, why, and where. We do need to update this now that we've had a couple name changes in the merging of those lists. I will also note that the noxious weed list on the state level, there are some new additions. We have recently added, I petitioned for Japanese honeysuckle, so Lanistera japonica is now a state listed plant. Cat's claw vine is now on the list, and beech vitex is on the list. We are currently petitioning Callery pear and camphor tree to try to get those on the list as well. So just some more updates. Okay, final thing I want to get through. I want to talk about this horizon scanning project that I'm working on. So for the most part, most of the species that come to me in my program are, for some reason, we know that, there's a reason people are concerned, they're noticing it in the natural areas, or it's being proposed for, like, say, a biofuel or a biomass crop species. So we kind of have an idea, heads up, but what about those species that are a big surprise? So I attended a talk in Ireland a few years ago and saw a researcher by the name of Helen Roy give a presentation about a horizon scanning project she did in the UK that was essentially, it was all taxa, and they put together a working group to determine what are the invasive species threats on the horizon for the United Kingdom. So I basically got her permission to duplicate those efforts in Florida. Florida Fish and Wildlife and Deans for Research at University of Florida have funded this project. We're about a year behind because of COVID, but I will tell you the final results should be coming in June. This uses rapid risk assessment and consensus building to identify invasive species threats to the state of Florida. So the context, current approaches employed to predict and regulate invasive species in the US occur post-introduction. We have those 30 points of entry that I mentioned before. This makes us a gateway for introductions, intentional and accidental introductions for the Southeast United States, and then in turn, the whole United States, continental United States. And then what is horizon scanning exactly? It is a method used to identify potential threats and emerging issues to inform policy, regulations, and decision-making. Generally, this has been used in like big tech, medical fields, that kind of stuff. But more recently, they're starting to shift this over to do some horizon scanning for natural resources and conservation issues, including identifying potentially invasive species. So we got together in 2019 in December. I assembled this expert working group of, I think there were 30 people in attendance. We've added some folks here. I think a total of about 50 people have done some part of this work. We met at Austin Carey. We were fortunate enough to bring in Julie Lockwood to facilitate. She's done some of this horizon scanning work. She came in from Rutgers. We had a couple people come in from Canada, some other universities around the Southeast, and then heavy representation from University of Florida and local agencies, USGS, Florida Fish and Wildlife, and FDACS. So we wanted to also identify pathways. So I mentioned the intentional and accidental introductions at the beginning. So now the pathways are how those introductions happen. So we use this framework. Basically, there's dispersal. So this would be your release in nature, your escape from confinement, and your transport contaminants. So just as simple as dumping your goldfish out. Hold on one second. Simple as dumping your goldfish out in the water, or you dug up a bunch of plants and you just toss them over the fence. That could be a way to disperse a species. A vector pathway is more of your transport stowaways. So things that are, biofouling, like stuck on the outside of those ships, would be a transport stowaway. And then movement of commodity. So this would be less frequent, but here we're talking about corridors. So, man-made connectivity can facilitate movement of a species, and then also unaided. So as simple as this coconut floating from, Cuba to South Florida would be an unaided dispersal. So our preliminary results, I know we're supposed to be talking about plants here, but I'm very excited about this work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of the groups. So we divided into 5 groups. Invertebrates, we had both terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates, vertebrates, marine, and plants. We used rapid risk assessment. So instead of that long 39 questions, there were 3 questions. Likelihood of arrival, likelihood of establishment, likelihood of impacts. Scored 1 to 5 with the highest, you multiply those scores and the highest possible score was 125. This tool I'm going to add into the IFAS assessment toolbox to sort of pre-screen species. So if something scores very low, we might not necessarily do a full risk assessment on it. Or prioritize something with a higher score. So anyways, here's some of the early contenders. So we have this is a species of cabbage moth, got 100. And then I list the pathway below. So this was most likely pathway is a transport contaminant. The nun moth and cotton bollworm here. For our aquatic invertebrates, we have zebra mussels. Those, believe it or not, are not escaped in Florida yet. I'll get back to that. But this red swamp crayfish, both scored 125, the highest possible score. So they have terrible impacts. Pretty likely they're going to get here. Pretty likely they're going to establish here based on proximity to Florida, climate matching and such. So what, I don't know if you're paying attention, but there's been some chatter about something that's happening right now. There's these things called moss balls that people who keep aquariums will buy these little moss balls at pet stores. And it's been discovered that these mothballs have zebra mussels in them and other non-native mussels. So they're importing these mothballs in from overseas. They've been distributed right now. I think we're up to 30, it says 32 states, including Florida. A friend of mine over at USGS is getting calls about this. We're begging people not to throw them out because this will be a release event for zebra mussels. And I can only imagine what zebra mussels would do to Florida Springs if they got in there. So this is pretty concerning and unexpected. Next, we have the marine team. 3 of the top contenders: colonial tunicates, this bryozoa, and Asian date mussels. And then again, you see transport stowaway contaminants, very common with these species. For vertebrates, we have a different, now we're getting into our escape from confinement. So it's not, a vertebrate's going to be most likely that you're bringing it in as a pet, or for some reason from, in the case of this crab-eating macaque, they use them in biomedical research. And they get out or they're released. So here are our early contenders for the vertebrates: the crab-eating macaque, the Japanese fire-belly newt, and African clawed frog. So we don't really want those to get out in Florida. Plants, we have the common privet, colonial bentgrass, and Scotch broom. So here, I think the plant team, we are actually in the process of writing up our paper for this. We ended up with 6 high-risk species based on that are not here yet and likely to become invasive. So those species, for my team, I'm going to do risk assessments for those and get those into the database, and then in turn pass all of that information on to FDACs so that they can potentially either regulate the pathway or regulate the plant itself. The other species, the other groups, that all that information is going to go to Florida Fish and Wildlife. For example, the vertebrate list, they're doing some work right now trying to preemptively regulate some of the reptiles that are and amphibians that are being sold at these these trade shows to try to keep the next Burmese python out of the Everglades. So we're really trying to stay on, absolutely on the furthest end of the invasion curve with this project. Okay, that's what I have going on right now. But I do want to just circle back to what's important here. First, not all non-native species are invasive. So really important set of criteria before something is really considered invasive. Invasive species can cause harm to ecosystems, our economy, and sometimes to human health. The longer it takes to identify an invasive species, the more damage is done. So again, I'm just going to hammer home that we want to stay on that one side of the curve. The IFAS assessment is a public resource. So, we don't just serve the university. This is part of my, bulk of my extension appointment at the university. I'm here to help you make the best decision about what plants you want to put in your yard. Finally, prevention is the best management option. So again, assessment.ifas.ufl.edu to access that database. You can email me directly at Deah Lieurance, ufl.edu, but also if you go up here to contact us in our on the website, those emails come directly to me. And I just acknowledge my funding sources: Florida Fish and Wildlife, and Deans for IFAS Deans for Research and Extension. And I think I've left about 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lieurance. That was a really great presentation. I learned a lot. I'm going to go through a couple of the questions here, and there may be some more that come up. The first one that I see is, so how bad is it to have a category 2 plant in your yard, i.e. queen palm or bottle brush?
Well, how bad is it? I mean, it really depends. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's bad. I just would really be careful to make sure those don't escape. I will say that bottle brush in particular is a kind of a contentious species, right? So it's related to Melaleuca that's, all over South Florida. we did do a risk assessment on the bottle brush, and I can't remember if it's, I think it is Melaleuca now. But we did the risk assessment. The risk assessment came out as a high risk for invasion. So right now, University of Florida, I can't recommend that species. But just to follow up with that, I do have some land manager friends who have been sending me photos. Bottle brush, you know, your weeping bottle brush, I believe is the one that's out there, is starting to encroach on natural areas in central and South Florida. So they're starting to see it in natural areas, which again, in this case is, you know, further justification that we should, you know, pay attention to the risk assessments as well as the risk or the invasion diagnoses. So I would just be very, you know, if you can cut it down and replace it with something else, maybe that would be the best option, but maybe not the most viable option. I would just try to do what you can to minimize the spread of those seeds.
Great. Let's see. What if an invasive actually has value, such as food for livestock or humans? Is there a type of management to channel these growths into useful areas, or do we just work to eliminate them because the risk-benefit profile is too negative?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in some cases, the risk of escape, you know, on the risk side of this, the risk of escape can be mitigated. So the state of Florida, for example, has a program, you know, they have something called the non-native planting rule. It used to be the biomass planting rule or biofuel planting rule. It kind of keeps shifting as more things get brought in for different reasons. But generally, anything greater than 2 contiguous acres has to go under permitting. The permitting process requires, I think if you recall on the slide about the predictive tool, there was, you know, for a new use. This would be an example for a new use. So if you're changing the volume of species that you're putting into the landscape, you're changing the risk. So we do a risk assessment. I give that report to FDACS. FDACS reviews the risk assessment, asks me some questions, and then they either say yes or no to the permit. So if it gets into the permitting phase, then they institute best management practices. And so most often it's things like, you know, maintaining a buffer around the field. So, you know, either spraying or mowing or some kind of physical barricade to keep things from escaping that way. They also, you know, there's some other, you know, if it's a seed crop, you know, I think there's one in Central Florida called palm oil tree that's under permit right now. They shake those trees to get the seeds off. Well, they ask them to do some mitigation there to keep those seeds from just flying everywhere. And then they also have them put a deposit down on, you know, how there's an estimate of how much it would cost to eradicate that species if it becomes a problem. So they basically, it's called a surety bond. So they'll put some money down. They put some money down on, you know, like insurance if it does become an invasive species. Generally though, if it's a species that's already in natural areas and it's already hurting, you know, there's an international group that was working for the UN, just did this global assessment of biodiversity. And they're showing that, you know, we're in a major extinction event. We know that. And they determined the 5 drivers of you know, the loss of biodiversity across the planet. One of those is, you know, along with climate change, is invasive species. So, you know, it's like, if those species are starting to reduce the biodiversity, and you think about Florida, we have some of the most unique habitats in the United States with the Everglades and the springs and, you know, some of our, you know, our pine forests. You know, how much value do you put on the biodiversity versus, you know, an economic crop? So I think that's, I'm a scientist. I will put the information out there. I will hand that information in a report to a regulator and let them make the decision. But on a personal level, I would err on the side of protecting the biodiversity.
Wow, that's great. I'm going to go over to the Q&A for a minute here. This was a question about the EDIS publication, and they're wondering when the update will be available.
Ooh, I have to say about my to-do list. I mean, I don't know. I'll try to get it done by the end of the year. I got another one that I'm fixing right now for someone else, so I'll do my best. But I'm sure we can, you know, when that does become available, I can email you, Claire, and then you can send it out to the group.
I'd be happy to do that.
Yep.
Let's see. I do have everybody's email address from since we register people now. Are there native plants that are like invasive species but not invasive because they're native? I think you touched on this in the beginning.
Yeah, so the whole concept of a native invasive is, yeah, they're weeds. So I would say some good examples of some of those native species that you still have to, maybe do some management on. I know personally, I battle smilax and my greenbrier in my yard. Like I dug a tuber up one day and I just kept digging and I was like, what is this? So, your smilax, Virginia creeper is another one that can be a problem. So yeah, there are definitely some natives that you do also need to take care of. But generally, just in terms of invasion science and, we try not to use those two words together. Just go with weed.
Let's see. The next one is, does UF IFAS plan to add basket grass to the assessment? I've searched for the scientific and common name and cannot find it in the assessment database.
Wavy basket grass, is that?
I'm not sure. Maybe they'll respond here. And if you want, we can kind of.
Yeah, I can look into that. Let's see. Yeah, we don't have it in there. We do have a species request form. So if you can get the scientific name and submit a request, we can try to get that in the list.
And would they do that right there on the IFAS assessment website? I posted the link to that website earlier during your talk.
Okay. Yeah, so where is that? So on the first page, if you see, is there a non-native species missing from the database? And there's a button that says request form. That would take you to those requests.
Awesome. That's a really good thing to know. With plants like camphor, if they receive invasive status, will the city county owned properties be tasked with removal? Here in Orlando, at Lou Gardens, there are many very old specimens.
Yeah, so just because it goes on a noxious weed list doesn't mean that suddenly we're going to require eradication. We meaning not like the state of Florida. So what the noxious status does is, so you can still have it on your property. What you can't do is cut it down and throw it away inappropriately or move seeds around. We caught one woman, I was on a Facebook group and she was selling, she had a bucket with water hyacinth in it and she was giving it away to her neighbors. And we were like, no, you can't do that. So, we're just, even though something like, so why would we list something that's already so widespread? Well, another thing that a noxious weed listing can do is help prioritize management efforts. So it might free up some money just with a different designation. Regional, local governments can do their own legislating based on whether or not that species is on a list or not. So I think it's Hillsborough County did some regional, some of their own county legislation around, I think it was lead tree or Brazilian pepper, one of those, to where, they were like, this all has to be removed by a certain date. You can't plant it, because of this list, but, as soon as we get it removed from all of our property, then we're going to start going to the private. So, I mean, it's just really spot to spot to spot in terms of how people use that listing.
And it certainly helps give some validity to, encouraging people to remove a plant or. What can I tell my association about controlling air potato vines that are trying to cover our natural areas?
Honestly, air potato, you're going to want to pick up the bulbules, those the little aerial, like little potato tubers. Put them, double bag them. Do not put those in compost. But generally, in terms of controlling it, you can request, I believe, I want to say from the state, you can request air potato beetles. So we're not really we're not investing as much in terms of like spraying to control air potato vine because the biocontrol has been so effective. And we do have another important update. USDA down in Fort Lauderdale, the Invasive Plant Research Laboratory, they found a second beetle in the same genus that attacks. The air potato beetle that we have. You'll see those little red beetles; those eat the leaves. But they found another one, and it's Lilioceras is the genus that it targets those bulbules. So I think with both of those biocontrol, and that one's going to be released soon. So with those two coming out, I think we won't really have to worry too much about it's just a matter of time, and we don't have to put so much money and effort into controlling that particular plant.
That's fantastic. I know the beetles have been super successful.
Yeah.
And I guess I've heard there may be a biocontrol for Brazilian pepper that's being studied anyway.
Yeah, there's 2 biocontrol agents that are being released for Brazilian pepper tree. So those, the jury's still out on how much damage that it does, but there's some really good research going on at University of Florida with Carrie Mentier's lab, where they're looking at how those biocontrol agents work on the plant. Is it reducing the amount of fruit it's putting off? Is it just removing leaf area? Like what's happening to the plant? So that's really exciting. There's also a biocontrol agent that's going up. I think it's in public comment now. So once you develop these biocontrol agents, it takes years and years and lots of testing because we want to make sure that those insects are not going to eat anything else, that they're specific to the plant that we're trying to control. So that takes a lot of years and a lot of cross-continental research. And then once it gets to the point where they're like, okay, this is specific enough, we want to release it, then they have to put that out for approval from the federal government. And then when they do that, then they have public comment. So right now we're in public comment for a biocontrol agent for Chinese tallow, which, God, like that one's a headache, but we're anticipating a bit of a fight with that one because beekeepers love Japanese tallow. And we're like, but it's really bad for the environment. And coincidentally, your common honeybee is also non-native. So yeah.
Very complicated. I have just a couple more questions. We've got 2 more minutes or so. And let's see. Is there a native plant list to recommend in place of non-natives used in home landscaping, like native fireweed rather than non-native fireweed, or maypop instead of non-native blue-flowered vine? Would that be like the Florida native plant?
Yeah, I don't know if the Florida Native Plant Society might have a list, but I would say that this would be a great opportunity to plug the Florida Friendly Landscaping list, where, it's not just native, but there are natives in there with non-natives, and that list can be sorted. You can click a button and just get your natives that way.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Is there a difference between Melaleuca viminals, is that how you say that, and Callistonum viminals? Because they both look like the same plant when you look them up.
It is the same plant. That's a taxonomic change. So Callistemon, I think it's pronounced viminalis.
Thank you.
Although I usually wing it with the Latin pronunciations. But yeah, Callistemon and it recently went through a change from Callistemon to Melaleuca. The taxonomists will just shift things around. So sometimes that gets a little confusing. We have to be very careful. Like with that Horizon Scan project, we did a really thorough, we started with 9,600 and some species that we culled down to just a few hundred that we assessed. But we also had to go through and look for all of the synonyms, things, as things change. So
the moving target.
it is a moving target, yeah.
Okay, there's a couple more questions about lists and some treatments, which are kind of, I know kind of sometimes can be difficult to answer. One question is, I'm a landscaper in Southwest Florida. What is the most effective way of destroying invasive plants? And
so I would just, there's another, Florida, part of our extension efforts, being a land grant university, we have a lot of resources. I would say if you're interested in specific ideas about, controlling an invasive plant, so, your control methods for one will be different than another. Go to the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants website. They have a plant database there as well that, not for every invasive species, but for a lot of them, there'll be different management strategies there. And there are folks, I don't do management. I don't kill things, but I do have many friends who do. So Stephen Enlow, Jay Farrell, James Leary, those are some of the researchers over at the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants that can answer your questions.
Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just pop that link really quick in the chat box. With that, I think, unless Deirdre, if you have anything you would like to add, I think this has just been a really fantastic webinar. I've learned a lot, and I think this information is really important to get out there and really understand about getting ahead of that curve. I get asked that a lot, why caution? And now I can say I really understand much better.
Thank you so much, Claire and Deah, for doing this, because it was badly needed. We have a lot of confusion when we train our landscape designers and installers about different lists and what plants. But I will say, once they understand the need for it, there's lots of other species. They just make substitutions, and we are finding the building community in general to be very compliant. It seems like it's the homeowners and the big box stores is where the plants are sneaking into the landscapes. So, but this has been really helpful.
Great.
Okay.
Obviously, I'm very passionate about this.
It's a good thing to be passionate about.
Yeah.
It could be worse.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right,
Bye.
bye-bye.